Over the weekend, I had an epiphany, and I don't think I'm ever going to watch Saturday Night Live again. I know there's more important shit going on, but this is related to the important shit. Sort of. So bear with me here. So, Saturday night, I'm watching SNL. The host is J.J. Watt, who is apparently an NFL football player, though I had never heard of him before he was announced as host because I despise football and pay as little attention to it as possible. And, I mean, he's fine as host. Seems like an affable galoot. When an athlete hosts, SNL typically spends half the show making fun of them in a very gentle, good-natured way, and the other half joking about what nerds their cast members are by comparison. And there was a lot of that. Watts didn't embarrass himself. I mean, he was no John Cena. Let's not get carried away. But he was well above average for athlete hosts. At least from what I saw. I turned off the TV before update and went to bed. During the first musical number, the musical guest is Luke Combs, who I'd also never heard of before he was booked for this show. Judging from the portion of the one song I saw him sing, he makes cliched, shamelessly pandering country music that seems to have been written in the hope that it will someday be licensed for a truck commercial. I actually love country music, but there are few styles of music I hold in lower esteem than this kind of country music. So when my wife turns to me and says, "I'm going to bed," in the middle of Luke Combs' shitty Big and Rich pastiche, my immediate response is, "Me too." She says, "You're not going to watch the rest of it?" And I say, "Nah, I think I'm done." And as I said it, I realized that I meant not just that I was done watching this particular episode of SNL, but that I was done watching it, period. I've watched SNL since I was a kid. When I was like 10 or 11, staying up until 1 a.m. to watch an entire episode live felt like an act of rebellion. A small rebellion that my parents didn't mind, but still, I was supposed to be in bed, and I was up, and I was watching TV, and it was irreverent. Take that, establishment. For the last, 20 years or so, my SNL watching has continued almost entirely out of habit. I've watched it because I've just always watched it. Maybe I was attached to it because I started so early, I associated it with my childhood, and I didn't want to cut it loose. Whatever the reason, it definitely wasn't that I found the show funny, because at no point in my adult life have I ever found Saturday Night Live to be consistently funny. In fact, it's almost always been frustratingly unfunny. A typical SNL sketch works like this. We're introduced to a bunch of normal people in a normal situation, eating dinner at a restaurant, for example. Then, after we establish the normality of it all, the weirdo comes in, and the weirdo is different. He has a strange name, like Bertold Bringle-Nut. You like that? I just made that up. And maybe he has a silly job, like he paints bricks on those miniature houses made out of wooden blocks. But he insists on being referred to as a stonemason. And then what happens is, for the next, 4 to 8 minutes, all the normal people repeatedly draw attention to how weird the weirdo is. And if we're lucky, there'll be a half-assed attempt at a punchline at the end. Now, not every SNL sketch is like that. There are also those which are the inverse of the sketch I just described, where there's one normal character and 3 or 4 weirdos, and it's the one normal guy who spends the entire sketch pointing out how weird the weirdos are being. There are other commonly used formulas, but most SNL sketches are built according to the "hey, everybody look at the weirdo, isn't he being weird" model. And that's too bad, because that's a terrible model that almost guarantees the sketch won't be funny, no matter how talented the performers in it happen to be. And throughout its history, right on up to now, SNL has had some absolutely fantastic performers in its cast. The look at the weirdo sketches aren't funny because a joke tends to land better when the audience is allowed to get it for themselves. And the look at the weirdo sketches consist of almost nothing but the characters emphasizing the supposedly funny bit. For instance, in the last episode I watched, there was a sketch where J.J. Watt and A.D. Bryant played parents, and Kyle Mooney played their son. And the premise was that the son had accidentally walked in on his parents having sex. So the parents tried to explain to the son that what he saw was totally normal, only they started boasting about their sexual prowess. Dad bragging about how he's a big dog who had that thing woofing. Mom talking about how her lil nana turns dad out, with the son spending the sketch acting grossed out and commenting on how inappropriate the whole thing is. Because that's how comedy works, isn't it? Something inappropriate happens, and a character stands there pointing at it, repeating how inappropriate over and over. That's why Leslie Nielsen was so funny in Airplane, because he was constantly acknowledging how comically off-kilter everything going on around him was, to make sure that everyone in the audience understood what the joke was supposed to be. Right? It's so frustrating because there have been so many genuinely funny people who have worked on SNL as writers and cast members. Bill Murray, Eddie Murphy, Conan O'Brien, Amy Poehler, Tina Fey, Kristen Wiig, Will Forte, Maya Rudolph. In the current cast, I love almost everyone. Kate McKinnon, Kenan Thompson, Cecily Strong, Beck Bennett, Kyle Mooney, Aidy Bryant, Heidi Gardner, Melissa Villaseñor. Leslie Jones just left after last year, and she was hilarious. Bowen Yang just joined this season, and he's fantastic. They're all fantastic, and I know every goddamn one of them knows how to tell a joke. And if you know how to tell a joke, you should know how to write a sketch, because they both rely on the same basic principle in order to work, and that principle is called closure. Closure in this context refers to when a storyteller leaves out a little bit of information and allows the audience to fill that bit in for themselves. That's what happens when you get a joke. That's why when you tell a joke, you're not supposed to explain it. You're supposed to let the audience get there themselves. I'll show you what I mean. I'll tell the same joke the right way and the wrong way. So here's the right way. A woman's at a restaurant waiting for her food. The waiter arrives with her steak. The woman says, "Waiter, this stinks of liquor." The waiter takes 3 big steps back and says, "How about now?" Here's the wrong way. A woman's at a restaurant waiting for her food. The waiter arrives with her steak. The woman says, "Waiter, this stinks of liquor." The waiter takes 3 big steps back and says, "How about now?" And the woman says, "Oh, it was you." Now, maybe you think that's a good joke, maybe you don't, but clearly the first way is the better way to tell it, because it lets the audience put the pieces together. Oh, the waiter's the one who smells like liquor, not the steak. When I told it the second time, I made that connection myself instead of letting the audience get there on their own, and smothered the punchline. And that's what most Saturday Night Live sketches do, only they don't just do it at the end, they do it over and over throughout the course of the sketch. Oh, also, most sketches on SNL consist of the characters just restating the premise of the bit. There's no escalation, there's no twist, no development, just, "This is weird," followed by, "Yep, still weird," followed by, "Are you seeing how weird this is?" until they light the applause sign and fade out to commercial. Look, I'm not being unreasonable here. I don't expect perfection, but tepid mediocrity is the rule on SNL, not the exception. Writing comedy is hard, I know, because I write it. 2 of the series I produce for this channel, Steve and Stuffy and The Whirlpool, are comedy series, in theory. When Steve and Stuffy is in production, I usually only have a day to write an episode before I have to shoot it, edit it, and have it ready to be released. That's not a lot of time, which means I'm almost always shooting a first draft. A revised first draft, if I'm really on the ball. The best episodes of Steve and Stuffy include some solid laughs, tell a complete story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, have a point to make, and finish with a strong punchline, but lots of them fall well short of that standard. Of course, in my defense, I'm hardly a comic genius, and I write the episodes myself. SNL has a large staff of experienced comedy writers. If I turn out an underwhelming episode of my little-seen, no-budget YouTube series, it doesn't really cry out for an explanation. But how about the fact that Saturday Night Live is almost never any good? Ever wondered what the hell's going on there? Because I have. Maybe it's the cult of Lorne Michaels. Maybe it's the lazy over-reliance on recurring characters. Maybe it's the fact that it's live and there's no time for the performers to memorize any of their lines, so everyone in every live sketch is obviously reading off of cue cards, and for some reason, even after 45 years on the air, they still haven't figured out how to block and shoot sketches to minimize how distracting that is. Or maybe it's how lazy and formulaic and contrary to basic principles of comedy so many of the sketches are. But like I said, this formula I've been complaining about doesn't apply to every SNL sketch. There are other types the show goes back to again and again. There are the ones where the premise is just a thinly veiled excuse to have cast members bust out a series of celebrity impressions. There are the political sketches, which... Actually, let me talk about those, because now that I think about it, they're the reason I decided to stop watching the show. Okay, so the cold open for the last episode was about the impeachment trial, and the premise was that the real impeachment trial has been dry and boring, so SNL was going to present the trial we all wish had happened, which basically meant an episode of Judge Mathis with cast members walking on and doing weak, obvious shtick as various people involved in the impeachment. Alec Baldwin played Trump, Beck Bennett played Mitch McConnell, and sang a Send in the Clowns parody with lyrics that sounded like they'd been scribbled down on the side of a coffee cup right before the show went on the air. Alex Moffat played Adam Schiff and had one line about Schiff's gecko eyes. The whole thing was pointless. It had nothing of any relevance to say and seemed rooted in no point of view more specific than let's reference shit that actually happened, but make it wacky. In other words, it was like pretty much every other political sketch SNL has ever produced. Political comedy on SNL has been shallow and obvious and cowardly ever since 1975, when Chevy Chase figured out all he had to do to get a laugh as Gerald Ford was fall down. Even some of the more biting bits of political satire the show has done have always eventually been undermined. Remember when Tina Fey played Sarah Palin during the 2008 presidential campaign, and one of her sketches consisted of a nearly verbatim transcript of what the real Palin actually said during an interview? By SNL standards, that was practically a scene from Dr. Strangelove. But then, in a later episode, they had the real Sarah Palin come on the show, just to let any conservatives watching know that it had all been in good fun. The lack of a specific point of view or point to make is a problem for most SNL sketches, but it's most glaring in political sketches. Satire without a point of view isn't actually satire. Satire takes a side. It makes an argument. It approaches from an angle. The closest thing to an angle I've seen in SNL's recent political material, including full sketches and jokes on Weekend Update, is the complaint that the impeachment process isn't entertaining enough, which ain't exactly the stuff of Swiftian wit. On SNL, what is usually described as political satire consists of little more than bad impersonations and winking references to current events, with the occasional cameo appearance by an actual politician. The show is always more than happy to play with a politician, especially one who's currently making headlines, regardless of their ideology or party affiliation, even if they're a xenophobic Trump supporter who was a moderator in a racist Facebook group the same year they ran for Congress. Right, Dan Crenshaw? Or even if they're a xenophobic Trump. Right, Trump? If Saturday Night Live was a person, and it asked me to summarize why I'll no longer be watching it in just a few words, I think I'd have to quote Sting, the wrestler, not the guy from the Police, the band, not the ones who murder black people, who said to J.J. Dillon after Dillon stripped him of the World Heavyweight title on the first episode of WCW Thunder due to a controversy surrounding his win over Hollywood Hogan at Starrcade 97 a week and a half previous, and I quote, "You got no guts." Yes, I did construct that whole tortuous sentence just so I could shoehorn in a 22-year-old pro wrestling reference. When you make a video, write it how you want. Anyway, that's what hit me during the J.J. Watt episode. I was sitting there with my country in the middle of an impeachment trial where an obviously corrupt and dangerous president was going to be allowed to remain in office because the people in control of the institution tasked with judging him are just as corrupt and dangerous as he is. Listening to Luke Combs perform his god-awful, soulless, catchphrase-based song, thinking about that cold open with its dull, harmless mockery of Trump and the GOP and obligatory jokes at the expense of the Democrats who are doing the best they can to save the fucking country from these monsters, even in the face of certain defeat, just so the show can maintain its cherished pretense of being nonpartisan. And my wife said, "I'm going to bed," and I was like, this is it. This is when I finally turn my back for good on this gutless, useless fucking show that has brought me nothing but frustration and aggravation. And I did it. And it feels good. Not that I expect the folks at SNL to feel too threatened. At this point, the show's become an institution through sheer inertia. The network will keep it on the air for the same reason I kept watching it for so long, because that's just the way it's been for so long. NBC is never going to cancel the thing, so I took the next best available option and canceled it myself. Of course, now that I won't be watching SNL anymore, I'll have to think of something else to do Saturday nights from 11:30 to 1. Pretty much anything would be an improvement. I could watch movies, read a book, go to bed. I could just turn off the TV and sit silently on the couch for 90 minutes, which would probably allow for the smoothest transition, since that's pretty much what I was doing already.